So the question is on ignorance, and since we don't know what it is that we don't know, sometimes you could be under the illusion that what used to be a recurring thought pattern during an activity, it ceases to exist. So it might give you the impression that you are more present, whereas it could also mean that you are not aware of, or you do not know what else you are dismissing. Let me give a concrete example. So, okay, go back to the example we use very often, doing dishes. When doing the dishes, we daydream and we just see it as some activity to be done and move on. And so that is at a gross level, that is not helping you find presence. But at a finer point, you could overcome that urge to daydream, but at the same time not fully appreciate the feel of the water, or the textures and the various sensory perception. One could still think to oneself that, yeah, I'm not daydreaming, I'm realizing what I'm doing. I'm doing this plate now, I'm doing the next fork now. And it's not quite the same as being fully open to. So this is a very contrived example, I understand, but there are other events in everyday practice that do not require such simple explanation, that there is more involved thought patterns and more more opportunities for presence that we may miss without knowing that we are missing. So I'm curious to know how to avoid the trap of feeling like, okay, I do not get those thought patterns I used to get, and so I'm free of it, whereas you really are not. You might be ignorant of it.
Let's start with how you started your question with this word, ignorance. So this is used in various spiritual paths, this word ignorance, in different ways. It's pretty common in Buddhism because it's usually the translation for the three poisons, for the third of the three poisons: greed, hate or anger, and ignorance. But that's probably a pretty poor translation, and we should clarify what we mean in non-dual practice with ignorance. Because in common usage, ignorance means you just don't know. But in non-dual practice, we're very fond of not knowing. That's not what we mean by ignorance as a negative thing. So if you don't have a certain idea or intellectual knowledge about something, conventionally that might be called ignorance. But in spiritual practice, we can say you're more free. In a sense, you're more free to appreciate the moment because you're not cluttered with some piece of knowledge, some abstract construction that might block your appreciation of the present. So there's something to be said for ignorance is bliss in that sense. What I think is really meant by ignorance as a obstacle, as a cause of suffering in the spiritual context, is actually having something, believing something that's just not correct, which basically anything you believe is not correct. So holding on to any knowledge as true, that your thinking is true in some kind of objective world, is a barrier to your freedom. Not what is meant by ignorance, really. So it's not a lack of something, it's actually having something that's misleading. Having a wrong view, holding on to it. And every view other than clarity is a wrong view. If you don't really believe it's true and the views just come through your mind, they're not a problem. But if you believe they're true, in other words, if you think they're right, then they're wrong. So it's a clearing out, a letting go, an emptying of all our views that our practice is composed of. And the example you bring up, when we maybe forcefully, or whether forcefully or not, we're able to stop some kind of gross level dreaming and be what's conventionally understood as a little more present, but we're still not feeling the freedom and joy of liberation. I would suggest it's simply we're leaving one mode of thinking, the daydream, whatever it was, and replacing it with another, which is, why am I not present, or why am I not feeling the experience of liberation? Evaluating yourself. There's so many subtle things going on in our minds usually. So even if you're not specifically daydreaming, you might still be holding on to evaluation of what you're doing. This is good or this is bad. This is spiritual or not spiritual. I wish I had to do this, or I didn't, or I should like this and I'm not liking it. All kind of judgments and evaluations we make. So we haven't become free of thinking. We've just changed the mode of our thinking. And sometimes it can get worse, because if you're more evaluating yourself and judging how well you're doing being present, that can be quite a heavy, uncomfortable thing compared to just thinking about some fun event that happened yesterday. It might be more pleasant. Can feel like a huge leap of faith or transformation. When we perceive that anything we try to make or construct is leading us astray in terms of freedom. And you can't create presence. You can't create freedom. You can't create full appreciation. You can't create liberation. It's actually what's there all the time. All we can seemingly do, and even this we can't really do, but all we can seemingly do is let go. Is stop feeding the obscuring thought pattern, or whatever it is. And it doesn't matter if it's a daydream or a present evaluation. So we have such a habit in our conventional life, we're trying to make things happen that make us happy. Trying to make conditions happen that make us happy. And in a more spiritual context, we might be trying to make a certain mindset that makes us happy. But that person making is what the problem is. That person making is the source of anxiety, the source of separation. So to realize everything's happening just exactly as it has to happen. This conscious awareness is shining just exactly as it comes out of the universe, if you want to use that metaphor. There's nothing for me to do. Anything that me does creates the me, and creates the separation, and creates the anxiety. We're just kind of walking off that cliff into a kind of empty non-doing. Just becoming totally receptive. The self is usually, as we try to do that, it's still the self trying to do it. So the self is still there waiting to see the result and waiting to evaluate whether it's working or not, right? And that presence there is going to keep it from working completely. It's not all black and white, you know. Even like in your example with the dishes, if you stop daydreaming and just bring your attention to the water and the plate, you might still be having evaluation ideas and anxiety ideas and separation ideas, and whether I can succeed at being present or not might be there, so it might obscure the full freedom of the moment, but you'll still probably start to appreciate the feel of the water more than when you were daydreaming. If your daydream was really happy, it might not feel like you become happy. I don't know. But if your daydream was a negative, anxious one, it probably will feel better. So it's fine to do that, even though you know you're doing it from a conscious intent. But as that process is unfolding, there can be an awareness that any subtle thing I'm doing here, trying to create something, is simply keeping me away from it. The me is always away from the presence. It's keeping the me alive. There's an incredible realization when it just dawns, it just opens, that everything's already doing it. Everything's already happening in peace and liberation and brilliance. There's only letting go from your side that allows it to shine. I mean, it's shining anyway, but that allows you to taste it. Like you say, you can feel like you've let go of some gross level things. You might just be replacing it with a lot of other things. That feeling there's nothing I can do at first can feel negative or scary or frustrating. But then, when you go deeper with it, it's incredibly liberating. Incredibly relieving. This is not something I can control. This is not something I can create. something that's my very nature. It's at the foundation of conscious awareness. The mode of appreciation of presence is just your natural state when you've let go of the idea that there's anything you need to do. There's anything still that needs fixing. There's anything that still needs manipulating. There's anywhere else to get to. Just what's right here now.
Speak of evaluation and belief in a way that seems to be saying that they move us away from presence. I suppose I see evaluation and beliefs as beautiful in this part of life. And I really don't think, I can't really see how we can live without, how we can continue living on earth without evaluating and believing.
I don't know if we can.
It seems the life support system, that's what I mean. So I think if we attempted to take away evaluation and belief, we would not live.
Well, attempting to take it undermines itself.
Well, if we drop them.
Yeah.
If we drop them.
If they're dropped, there's freedom. But you can't drop them. That's just an experience you can have. When they're dropped, there's freedom. If you see your suffering, your discontent clearly, it's always linked to evaluation and belief. It just is. That doesn't mean it doesn't also help us to survive. It seems to. And it doesn't mean that we can or should get rid of them. I mean, if we can't, then it doesn't make sense to say we should. It doesn't mean they don't have a function. It doesn't mean we can't accept them as natural and no problem if we don't attach to them. But the more we attach to them, the more we think they're real, and the more energy we put behind them, the less freedom we experience. That's a phenomena I'm suggesting for you to test in your own experience.
Is it a different type when you say attaching to them? So is it that attached evaluation and attached belief?
Right, but it's a slippery slope, right? I mean, it's a very gray area. As soon as you have an evaluation, if you really believe it's true, that's attachment. And initially when it arises, there's got to be some belief in it, or why would it arise? But if you handle it very lightly, you use it for something practical, but you don't invest in it, then you're not going to suffer much around it. Maybe there'll be very subtle discontent. But that level of evaluations and beliefs we seem, like you say, we seem to need for survival. And it doesn't cause much problem if you don't put your life energy around it so much, if you don't obsess around it. But when we're invested, when we're putting our life energy in our evaluation, it means our life energy isn't naturally celebrating what's actually just arising. It means we've separated into a good and bad, a right or wrong. We have a dual world. We have duality, and so we have conflict, and so there's friction.
With any evaluation?
Yeah.
I suppose the example that I think of is the disused railway track. and I'm sitting, listening, observing on the railway track, and I hear this big engine coming up, and feel the vibration, smell, and then my life ends. It's not disused. And that's very alive, but it's also very alive to jump out of the way, to hear that, to feel that vibration and think, evaluation is, it's not disused.
Yeah, but in that example, are you really, if a train is really barreling down on you, do you really sit there and think about evaluation? Is it even really relevant to say it's evaluation? You just move. Is a deer evaluating? Sometimes deers don't move out of the car lights, right? Because they get tranced. That's a big problem. But when an animal runs away from something, is it evaluating? If so, it's such a light and quick evaluation, and you certainly can't say you're obsessing about it or anything like that. So it's an example of what I'd say there's very little attachment. It's immediate action. It's immediate happening. I would say it's often so quick and so natural that there's not even involvement in thought, really. So I don't think that's an issue. But if you then say, trains suck, I really hate trains, I really hate that there's tracks here, then they're suffering.
But what if there is engagement in thought?
Then there's some degree of suffering. If the thought, if you believe your thought is right, because thought is a separation, right? To have one thought, to have one statement, you have something else that's negative. That must exist in the world, otherwise you wouldn't want to assert one thing. You assert one thing, you're rejecting something else. There's always a division, there's always conflict. Whether it's with someone else who has another idea, or whether just with the phenomenal world that has another idea from what you like and what you don't like. So preferences and likes and dislikes always have some suffering in them. If we're light about them, they're natural, and like you say, it doesn't seem we can be without them completely, and it seems that they're necessary or useful for survival, and I agree. And it's make-believe to say we're just going to not have them, because they exist as phenomena. But we can observe that the more we attach to them, the more we hold them, the more we believe them, the more they become like the center focus of our consciousness, the less we're enjoying presence itself. And the more we're in a conflict situation, conflict phenomena, where there will be suffering, there'll be discontent. There'll be wanting things to be a certain way and dealing with the fact that they're not. They'll be dependent on conditions. So freedom is, conditions are utterly irrelevant. Awareness itself is always shining. And that's where joy is found, the source of joy. Awareness itself, not a condition of awareness that always changes. That's the freedom where you no longer feel vulnerable. You no longer feel you might lose it. Everything else, all our conditioned desires and wants and preferences and evaluations are all threatened, and we feel that. We might be in a good mood, so we're not obsessed by it, we're not filled with doubt, but then we're in a bad mood and we're more filled with doubt. But there can only be one approach, whatever you want to call it, one mode where we don't have any doubt, and that's where we're not requesting or requiring a particular condition that can change. And the only condition like that is just awareness itself.
Just wanted to add to Jamshed's point, when you said evaluating, what I thought of with the analogy that we previously discussed was, which, true story, instead of daydreaming, if the dishes, you start evaluating how much water am I using, how much soap am I using, I could do better than this. That sets off a loop where you try to improve, and now your attention is all going on how much water am I using, how much waste am I contributing to. which is arguably better than daydreaming, but not all the time, because sometimes you could say I was happier daydreaming while dishwashing because I didn't know. I was just, turn on the hot water and feel good about doing the dishes because I didn't pay attention to what's going on. And now with the constant evaluation, it just makes it more anxiety inducing. So maybe there's a balance.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good example. So, especially for people like us that are concerned with our impact on the world and evaluating ethically what we're doing, we start to identify goodness with how ethical we are, and I mean, we recognize that sometimes it's definitely suffering when we're dwelling on whether something's ethical or not. We get too burdened by it, and we can't make a decision, and we're obsessing about something small because, then we recognize this is not so healthy. But when it's not quite as obviously uncomfortable, we think this is really good. I'm really a good person that I think this. And this is what's going to lead to a beautiful world. People doing these ethical evaluations. And I want to promote it. And I'm not going to let go of this. And I am suggesting the very challenging notion to myself and all of us that that's not actually so healthy. And that's not actually bringing the beautiful world we want to bring. That the truest ethics of living in a beautiful way come naturally from enjoying presence. Whether in a particular instance we're, using the least hot water or not becomes secondary. If we're enjoying presence, and we're letting go of our self-centered thought, we will naturally act in a way that brings benefit to the whole world. Whereas if we're following our ethical analysis, as wise or intelligent in the conventional sense as we might be, sure, we might be physically harming the earth less than most people. But we're not engaging in a mode that's really free and joyful. And that can be felt by all other beings. Generally they might not be conscious of it, but that can be felt, I suggest. So, and our own lack of joy in that, ethical realm is itself the seed of more dissatisfaction and harm in the world. So instead of using our thinking, evaluating mind to say, okay, so what's the balance? We shouldn't do terrible things, but we shouldn't obsess about trying to do good things. How do we find the balance? What I'm suggesting is the balance cannot be found by your evaluating mind. What we can use is completely drop thinking and return to presence and take the most beautiful step, take the most loving step, I say trying, but when you really do this, there's no sense of trying anymore. But not trusting, letting go of thinking that the brain's evaluation can be correct. And you enter this unknown place that's scary. I don't know what I'm going to do. I've always done this ethical thing before. Now I don't know what I'm going to do. Maybe I'll be bad. That's what we think. Maybe I'm going to turn into a bad person if I let go of my ethical constraints. And I'm suggesting, completely let go of your ethical constraints. I don't say this this can be misunderstood, right? If you say that to someone that's going to let go of their ethical constraints, but they're not going to let go of their self-centered desires, then you're going to have big problems.
No, that's true even for us to...
Even for us, right. So when I say let go, it means you have to let go of everything. So you get to this empty place of presence, and then trusting that that's where love, that's where true joy, that's where freedom comes from. That's where true ethics come from. And it's a place of unknowing. It's a place of not knowing. Not to be confused with ignorance.
So you said that evaluation isn't going to come up with a balance. And your example about the washing up, how it progressed into just continuous evaluation. And can we not have a balance that doesn't come from evaluation, just that comes, which does involve evaluation, does involve presence? And it's okay. And it's not going to keep you away from presence forever, that we come in and out of evaluation. But if we have too much evaluation, I mean, isn't...
Yeah. And that's how it's going to be, right? I mean, evaluation doesn't disappear. Every human being I've ever met, no matter what stage in the spiritual path, is doing some evaluation. But we should recognize that true freedom is when evaluation disappears. But this isn't through time, so it's not like saying that I now no longer ever evaluate. That's evaluation. It's only in the moment. And when evaluation comes up, you recognize that there's a limitation in it, that there's a separation from presence in it. But it might be so minor, it's not going to cause a problem. But you can recognize that that's just a phenomenon. And does it belong in the natural world just as much as freedom from evaluation? Of course it does, because it arises. It's all totally natural.
I'd just like to say, it might not be the place for it, but I was in a conversation yesterday with two people in England, and one of them is very much involved with activism, climate change activism, environment, whatever, in schooling, coming up with a program. And the program is kind of encouraging the children to look at everything they're doing in terms of CO2 emissions. And it just seemed like inherently really unhealthy to me that they were going to be even rubbing something out with the eraser. That came up. It was like everything is going to be evaluated. You go straight to evaluation rather than presence. That's the first place is evaluation. It just seemed really unhealthy, but she was very enthusiastic about it. A lot of people are.
Yeah. Right.
They really care.
Right, that's just my point. And the point you're making is that we need some evaluation. We seem to in daily life. That's also true. And we shouldn't develop, and maybe your objection comes from this perception, is that we shouldn't develop this kind of evaluation bad thing, or get angry at ourselves because we have evaluation, or try to be living in this way where we never evaluate. Yeah, it's all unrealistic and unnecessary and unhelpful. Evaluation comes up, it has its practical use, it's fine. But also we can notice that the deepest freedom comes when we're free from any evaluation, when we're free from any thought, when we're free from any comparison.
You say you think that's where I'm coming from, but I'm coming from more than that. Not that it's fine.
Yeah, I'm just guessing.
That it's beautiful.
In a sense,
evaluation.
I would say it's beautiful in the sense that
life.
Right. In the sense that delusion, any delusion is beautiful in a sense, because it's part of it. Like a storm where someone dies is also beautiful because it's just part of it. It's part of the whole, and we can let go of evaluating our evaluations, for example. And yet, we also have to see that when we're thinking about two things in opposition to each other, which is inherent in evaluation, there's the arising of some level of tension. It can be very minor and it can pass quickly, and so it's not a problem. But there is some tension, the seed of that. And the more we give to that, when we start obsessing with it or getting stronger with it, it grows and grows. And when there's no idea at all, there's freedom. There's a great joy and freedom. But it's not like you're now trying to keep the space where no thought ever comes again. Your thoughts can come again, and that freedom can become a little limited. and then it can become full again and it become limited, that's fine. But it's believing that we're, most of us, addicted to believing that a control and evaluation, an analysis is going to get us freedom, is going to get us happiness, is the road to happiness. We're addicted to that in our culture, maybe in all cultures, particularly this culture.
I suppose
And I'm saying that's not true. That's not where happiness lies.
I suppose I don't think I find difficulty in evaluating what exactly is an evaluation.
Right.
Because if I smell some food and I go to eat it, or I go to, did I evaluate?
Right, that's my point. That's just my point. And as you get more into the evaluation, you can feel more tension and more problem. So a light evaluation that comes up, better not to evaluate it and make it worse.
When is it not an evaluation?
What's that?
If I smell something and I think eat, there's an evaluation, I would say.
Now you're saying that. But when you just smell it and you just go to eat it, it's just so natural. But if you notice yourself hesitating and starting to weigh...
vibration, I'm sitting on the train track, and that vibration, that's not natural. Vibration, you go, there's an earthquake. That's more natural than a train coming.
Well, no, they're
But
both...
that's an
ultimately,
evaluation.
that's right, because ultimately they're both natural.
No.
They're both totally natural.
So...
But one demands you get out of the train tracks. The other might also, you want to probably move in an earthquake.
No, but there is definitely an evaluation there, because... Yeah, you could just be an earthquake.
Yeah, but you probably still want to move. Yeah, there's different things that come, and so there's different responses. But if you're not dwelling on the conceptual realm, it's when you go into the conceptual realm, divorced from the whole of your experience, that suffering emerges. So if it's a natural, immediate thing, and you're not divorced from your surroundings, so-called surroundings, then there's not a division made. There's not that duality made. When you go into your mindscape, and that's separate from you've made the whole into pieces. And when the whole is in pieces is when agitation begins.
I suppose I think you've got to go into your mind. I suppose the difficulty, or not the difficulty, but why it doesn't really flow with me is that it's just like this thinking that going into the mind is wrong. It's like, and like if you go in there, it's wrong. And
there's no wrong or not, but there's an observation that I'm suggesting that you can evaluate in your own life. That when you dwell in a mind of duality, when you dwell in an abstract world of separate things, as opposed to the wholeness that we can also perceive, some kind of anxiety or stress begins. And to the degree that you do that is the degree that the stress that you experience. So, even when you say going into your head, in the act of trying to figure out what is going into your head or not, there's an evaluation that's separating yourself from the wholeness of life. But you might be talking or trying to evaluate an experience where there wasn't really separation in the wholeness of life. And you're deciding whether that you went into your head or whether that wasn't going into your head. But that's really a separation.
But it's not even a trying, like an example of on a train track. I wouldn't be...
So I would say you didn't go into your head until you think now that you were going into your head. So we think there's an objective truth to like whether you're going into your head or not. What I'm suggesting is there's only the act of abstracting your thought, and when we do that, we start to experience separation. So on the train tracks, you get up from a speeding train. I don't think that's happening. You can later and analyze it and say, I went into my head or this or that happened, but that's what your later thinking does. And in that later thinking, there's a reduction of appreciation of wholeness. But in that moment of getting off the train tracks, none of that's happening.
I suppose cognitive function.
What I'm suggesting is the cognitive function analysis is not really what's going on. That's what that's an activity we do when we decide to think about it. And that makes us more fragmented. It doesn't actually make us more fragmented, but we experience fragmentation, and the experience of fragmentation is an experience of suffering. Or discontent if it's mild, or low-level stress or agitation. So we can't think, I'm going to figure out what's actually going on. Am I going to my head? Am I not going to my head? But we can't actually know what's going on. What's going on is infinite and unlimited. But our very activity of thinking we know, that's an activity of limiting our appreciation of the whole. In other words, don't know. Don't know if you're going into your head or not, or if you're evaluating or not. When you're really suffering, it'll be obvious that you're evaluating. If you're talking about something that you're not even sure if you're evaluating or not, don't worry about it, because that's just more evaluation. Because none of what we think is going on is what's really going on. That's the essential message. What's really going on is pure presence. What we think about it is just what we think about it, which is also part of presence. But the very act of thinking is simply an act of separation and an act of feeling discontent.
But we don't have to think we know, though, do we? We can just,
Well, sometimes we seem to, but then we suffer, yeah.
To me, it seems to be just saying, just believe. If everything's believing, then we won't suffer so much.
Well, believing means you think a certain idea is true. If you think an idea is true, an idea is separate from the whole. So you're separated.
So
if you say believe in your direct experience, I'd agree with you, but that's not a belief.
Well, it's like
it's happening. There's a difference between what's happening and something we're holding in our mind. If we're holding something in our mind, our experience of wholeness is fragmented.
So if like Andy's turned that on, and if he says he knows that on, or if he believes that on, to me there's a difference there.
He says, say it again?
He knows that's on, and he says, I believe that's on. There's a very, very big difference there to me, very big difference. And I'm saying about if we stay in that belief state, then that is the awake state.
No, but belief is just stating that I am fairly sure this is true, but I'm not 100% true. I'm not 100% sure, right? Belief gives some degree of doubt to your thought.
It's other than that to me. It's like this is my relationship. This is what I'm going with. And if I say no, it's like this is like okay, the universe says this is.
I think this is getting too much caught to words. So we're using words differently. For example, I was using belief in a different way. I was using belief not whether I think something's on or not, but something I believe about the world. This is true and this is untrue. So in any case, these are just words. The point is simply how alive we are. When you're really alive, you're just not thinking of another abstract thing that's separate from the whole of your experience. You're just dwelling in the whole of your experience. If, as you're dwelling in the whole of your experience, someone says, is that on? And you say, yeah, I think it's on. It's not a problem. So we don't have to worry about it, right? But if we start to really obsess about whether it's on or not, suddenly we're not noticing everything. Our body, the world, the universe, the moment, we start to think it's really important. That's what I would call more of a belief. But conventional things, of course, we act in the conventional world, we say conventional things. But from the standpoint of liberation, none of it's true. From the standpoint of liberation, it's not true that that's on or not. Whether that's on or not is just according to our relative thinking. Everything's on. Everything's on all the time, exactly the same. in our conventional thinking, we say, is this light switch on? Is it off? And that's fine. But reality, liberation, is realizing everything's on all the time. And none of those things matter. That doesn't mean we don't use them. It just means they don't really matter in terms of your happiness. In terms of whether you can see in the dark, they matter. But in terms of liberation, in terms of satisfaction, they're irrelevant. And we're just freeing ourselves from the addiction, thinking that conditions are very relevant to whether we're happy or not. So, things we're already not evaluating, I don't want anyone to start evaluating anymore because of spiritual practice. If you ask, is this on or not, and you're not really evaluating it, or it's so quick, or it's so light that it doesn't matter, there's no problem there. It's when there is a problem that we're addressing with spiritual practice. It's when we feel burdened that we want to address. When we feel burdened, we can address it by letting go. That's all. So to go back to the dishes, you stop yourself daydreaming, you decide you're doing presence practice with the dishes. But you don't feel so free. That not feeling so free is your sign. Some kind of evaluation that's unnecessary is still going on. You just haven't stopped. We have to recognize this is not something I can control. It's not something I personally create from this separate person. If it's not something I personally create, then there's nothing I, this separate person, can do about it. If there's nothing I, this separate person, can do about it, then it must be here already, right? It must be here already. So I just have to stop getting in the way. And evaluating whether it's working or not is still getting in the way. So it often takes patience. It doesn't have to take patience, but that's our experience, is because the thinking habit just has its own inertia. So even your intention is to let go of it, it just keeps going. It might switch the material it's using, but it just kind of keeps going. And we just let go and watch that. We just don't feed it. And if we don't feed it, it eventually dissipates, and we realize the plate is wonderful. The water is wonderful. Not by saying those words, not by even thinking those thoughts. It's just because there's a plate. It's not even a plate, it's just that. You don't have a bunch of dishes to do. There's only holding that plate. You never have a bunch of anything to do. That's always an abstraction held in the mind. on this path and engage in this kind of process, we can notice that there's some fear often around not evaluating. We don't trust. We're afraid of what would happen if we actually just dwell in emptiness, or whatever word you want to use. Just are alive in the moment, without some judgment about this moment, without some future and past, without some objective to do, without some goal to get, without an identity. And that's our investigation. What is this when all that's dropped? What happens? Things don't disappear. We can do this right now. We become totally empty. We have nothing to do. We have no thought to think. And things don't disappear. They're just alive. You can have that taste that I'm not doing it, because I have nothing I'm doing. So I hope we're all doing this right now, and generally during these talks or whenever, I hope we're all trying out what we're contemplating. We might feel some discomfort, and we might feel, I want to do these things, and various ideas come up, we can't control them. That's all okay. Then we just let go, and we have nothing to do and nothing to think. And yet there's aliveness here. It's just happening. And the less you're evaluating, the less you're grabbing onto thoughts, the more alive it gets. Just because that's attention can be filled by it. It's not yours. But it is you. It's what you are. But it's not. It has nothing to do with that self that has all the issues and problems and ideas. Can we trust it? Can we trust this life just happening? This brilliant presence, instead of relying on our fixed idea and our self-story. we know that stress is there. There was an article that came up on my browser feed, or whatever it's called, from the New York Times, that was by a neurologist describing how much of our behavior comes from our body's mechanism to survive and monitor itself. Not monitor itself so much, but its instinct for survival. She was saying, I think it was a woman, she was saying, it's not just the things we recognize as physical things, like we get really hungry when our body needs to eat, but actually tons of our abstract thinking. And when we get angry, and when we feel peaceful, and when we think more of the future, and all this is coming from our body's needs, seeing yourself more as a machine, which is actually, this might be paradoxical to some people, but it's actually, I think, really helpful for the non-dual path to realize, because you let go of the validity of all these things that the ego comes up with, and the existence of the ego itself. Yeah, that all comes up, it's just a body mechanism. It's just survival mechanism. So much, we think this issue or that issue is important, but it's just how the body's getting by. And then you can recognize none of that is worth holding on to. But awareness itself is the container for all of that. It's free of all of that. All of that arises in awareness. And if we've turned to appreciate awareness itself, then those things that arise in it, we don't reject them, but they don't have any particular importance. We don't attach to them. And then we experience that freedom, because we're not bound to the fortunes of these things that are arising and fading away. That's kind of what I mean by not believing. It's like we don't reject the fact that we're these creatures that have these feelings and thoughts and all the rest of it. But we notice that we're just creatures having feelings and thoughts. They don't have any actual importance. We have a shift of importance to awareness itself that is always there as the backdrop, as the foundation for all those things that are displayed on it. question. Thank you for your commentary and further questioning.